August 2, 1993. Medellin, Colombia. The phone rang in a basement office that officially didn't exist, staffed by men whose names appeared on no government roster, funded by budgets buried in classified documents that would be destroyed before anyone could read them. The voice on the other end spoke two words that would set in motion the most intense manhunt in modern history. He's running. Pablo Escobar, the man who'd turned cocaine into an empire, who'd killed judges and journalists and presidential candidates, who'd bombed an airliner out of the sky just to eliminate one target, who'd made Colombia synonymous with narco-terrorism, had escaped from his luxury prison for the second time. The Colombian government was humiliated. The DEA was furious. And somewhere in the mountains surrounding Medellin, the world's most wanted criminal was planning his next move, protected by loyal sicarios, corrupt officials, and a population that viewed him as either a Robin Hood figure or a demon too dangerous to oppose. The official agencies had failed for years. The legal system had been corrupted. Traditional law enforcement couldn't touch him, so they created something unofficial, something deniable, something that operated in the spaces between law and war, where the rules that protected criminals didn't apply and the only metric of success was results. They called it Bloc de Búsqueda, the search block, but the men who actually hunted Escobar, the shadow team within the team, had no official name. The Americans who joined them, DEA agents who'd volunteered for an assignment that could end their careers or their lives, called them the Ghost Unit. Because ghosts don't follow rules, don't appear in reports, don't leave witnesses, and when they're done, all that remains is silence and bodies. This is their story, not the sanitized version you've seen in movies, not the romanticized narrative of good versus evil. This is the truth about what it took to bring down a man who'd made himself a god. About the Colombian Special Forces operators who'd lost friends to Escobar's bombs. About the American agents who violated every protocol in the book. About the street informants who knew one mistake meant their entire families would be massacred. About the innocent people caught in crossfire between a drug lord's paranoia and a government's desperation. It's about 16 months of raids that went wrong, intelligence that led to empty houses, informants who disappeared, and operations that ended with more questions than answers. About the moral compromises made when hunting a monster who understood that civilized rules were weaknesses to be exploited. And about the morning when the Ghost Unit finally cornered their target on a rooftop in Los Olivos, and someone had to make a decision that would haunt them forever. Take him alive and watch the justice system fail again, or end it permanently and live with the consequences. What would you have done? When the law is powerless and the criminal is untouchable. When playing by the rules guarantees he'll escape and kill again. When the only language he understands is violence. The Ghost Unit made their choice. And Colombia would never be the same. The story begins not with Escobar's escape, but with his surrender. July 1991. After years of bombings and assassinations, after the government had threatened to extradite him to the United States where he'd face life imprisonment, Pablo negotiated a deal that shocked the world. He would turn himself in, but only to a prison of his own design, built on his own land, guarded by men he selected, under conditions that were less imprisonment and more luxury resort with armed perimeter. The Cathedral, they called it, a hilltop compound with a soccer field, waterfall, jacuzzi, and enough space to continue running his cocaine empire without interruption. The Colombian government, desperate to end the violence, agreed. President Cesar Gaviria sold it to the public as a victory. Escobar was finally in custody. The reality was visible to anyone willing to look. Escobar had simply traded one fortress for another, except now he had government protection. He continued ordering executions, continued trafficking cocaine through corrupted guards who earned more from bribes than salaries, continued running the Medellin cartel as if nothing had changed. Except he'd made one mistake. He'd invited his enemies into his prison. Two members of a rival faction, men he suspected of stealing from him, were summoned to the cathedral for negotiations. Their bodies were discovered 3 days later, tortured so extensively that identification required dental records. The Colombian government, already embarrassed by the surrender deal, couldn't ignore this. They ordered Escobar transferred to a real prison. And Pablo, understanding exactly what that meant, real imprisonment followed by extradition followed by American supermax, decided to leave. On July 22, 1992, while soldiers were preparing to transfer him, Escobar and 10 of his closest associates simply walked out. Through tunnels they dug during construction, past guards they'd bribed, into vehicles that had been positioned hours earlier. By the time the government realized what had happened, Colombia's most dangerous criminal was in the wind, furious at the betrayal, armed with hundreds of millions in cartel resources, and determined to punish everyone who dared defy him. The initial response was chaos. The Colombian police mobilized every available unit. Roadblocks appeared on every highway. Informants were pressured, threatened, promised rewards. The DEA, which had been monitoring Escobar for years, offered intelligence support, satellite imagery, electronic surveillance. For 3 months, they found nothing. Escobar had disappeared into Medellin's slums like water into sand, protected by a network of supporters who saw him as a benefactor. The man who'd built soccer fields and housing projects, who'd handed out cash to the poor while the government ignored them. Every lead ended in empty safe houses. Every raid found abandoned rooms still warm from recently departed occupants. Escobar was always 3 steps ahead, warned by corrupted police officers, tipped off by informants who feared him more than they trusted the law. The Ghost Unit was born from this frustration. Colonel Hugo Martinez, the Colombian officer who'd been chasing Escobar since the 1980s, assembled a team of operators who met specific criteria. No family in Medellin that could be targeted for revenge, combat experience from Colombia's various insurgencies, and most importantly, a willingness to operate in moral gray zones that traditional law enforcement couldn't enter. He paired them with a small group of DEA agents, men like Steve Murphy and Javier Peña, who understood that catching Escobar required thinking like him, operating with his ruthlessness, abandoning the procedural niceties that had allowed him to escape justice for years. They were given one mission: find Pablo Escobar. The methods were left deliberately vague. The oversight was minimal. The accountability was non-existent, because everyone involved understood that if things went wrong, the unit would be disavowed, the operators imprisoned or worse, and the official story would deny they'd ever existed. The first 3 months were failures. Raids based on signals intelligence hit addresses minutes after Escobar had fled. Informants provided locations that turned out to be traps, empty buildings rigged with explosives, ambushes that killed Colombian Special Forces operators. The cartel was testing them, studying their tactics, always adapting. Escobar himself seemed to treat the manhunt as a game, calling radio stations to taunt authorities, sending messages through intermediaries that mocked their incompetence. He was winning, and he knew it, but the Ghost Unit was learning. They began developing their own network of informants, not the traditional police contacts who could be corrupted, but street-level operators, taxi drivers who noted unusual movements, prostitutes who serviced cartel members, shopkeepers who saw patterns in who bought groceries where. They used electronic surveillance in ways that pushed legal boundaries, intercepting radio communications, tracking cell phones through methods the DEA wasn't supposed to share with foreign governments. They established a pattern: gather intelligence, plan the raid, execute with overwhelming force before Escobar could react. Most raids still came up empty, but the margins were narrowing. Instead of missing him by hours, they were missing him by minutes. Instead of finding cold safe houses, they were finding breakfast still on the table, cigarettes still burning in ashtrays. The psychological pressure was deliberate. Escobar was used to being the hunter, the man who controlled when and where violence happened. Now he was prey, constantly moving, unable to stay anywhere for more than a few hours, watching his organization fragment as the Ghost Unit systematically dismantled his support network. The violence escalated in ways that shocked even a country numbed by decades of narco-terrorism. Escobar's response to the pressure was predictable and brutal. Los Pepis, perseguidos por Pablo Escobar, people persecuted by Pablo Escobar. A paramilitary death squad that targeted anyone connected to the drug lord. His lawyers, his accountants, his family members. The group operated with military precision, executing cartel associates and burning their properties in coordinated attacks that the police seemed unable to prevent. The official story was that Los Pepis was a vigilante organization formed by Escobar's victims. The truth was more complicated and darker. Evidence suggested connections to Colombian military intelligence, to DEA agents who looked the other way when Los Pepis struck, to the Ghost Unit itself. Years later, participants would admit what everyone suspected. Los Pepis was a tool, a way to pressure Escobar without official sanction, to target people the legal system couldn't touch. It was extrajudicial, illegal, morally compromised, and effective. As Escobar's network collapsed, his sicarios killed, his safe houses burned, his family hunted, the Ghost Unit's intelligence improved dramatically. Former cartel members, terrified of Los Pepis, began cooperating. Cell phone intercepts became more frequent as Escobar, desperate to coordinate his shrinking empire, took risks he'd previously avoided. The circle was tightening. The question wasn't if they'd find him anymore. It was when, and what would happen when they did. The break came from the technology Pablo trusted. He'd been communicating with his son, Juan Pablo, through radio telephone conversations that he believed were secure. But the ghost unit had deployed direction-finding equipment, sensitive receivers that could triangulate radio signals to within a few city blocks. Every time Escobar called his family, every time he stayed on the line long enough to comfort his son or speak to his wife, the equipment narrowed the search radius. By December 1993, they knew he was in Los Olivos, a middle-class neighborhood where a wealthy fugitive could blend in by pretending to be a successful businessman keeping a low profile. The surveillance intensified. Undercover operators watched houses. Informants reported unusual activity. A man matching Escobar's description seen briefly at a window. Groceries being delivered in quantities suggesting multiple occupants. Curtains that remained drawn at odd hours. On December 1st, the direction-finding equipment pinpointed a specific house on a specific street. The ghost unit mobilized. This had happened before, premature raids based on promising intelligence that evaporated into another empty building. But something felt different this time. The intercepts had Escobar's voice patterns. The surveillance showed security precautions consistent with his paranoia. The timing felt right. At 2 p.m. on December 2, 1993, the assault began. No warnings. No negotiations. The ghost unit hit the house with overwhelming force, flash grenades through windows, operators breaching doors simultaneously, suppressing fire to prevent escape. Inside, chaos. 3 sicarios opened fire immediately, the close-quarters battle turning the house into a deafening maze of gunshots and screaming. The operators moved room by room, clearing spaces with the precision of men who'd done this hundreds of times. 2 sicarios died in the initial exchange. The third surrendered, and then they heard footsteps above them. Someone running, heading for the roof. The rooftop chase lasted less than 2 minutes but became frozen in history. Pablo Escobar, barefoot, overweight from months of hiding, dressed in jeans and a dark shirt, burst through the roof access and ran. Behind him, Colombian National Police operators gave chase, weapons raised, shouting for him to stop. He didn't. Witnesses from neighboring buildings would later describe the scene with the surreal detail of people watching something they couldn't quite believe was real. The world's most powerful drug lord stumbling across clay roof tiles, the operators pursuing, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across a moment that would define a nation. Escobar made it perhaps 50 feet before the gunfire started. The official version says he drew a pistol, forcing the operators to shoot in self-defense. Witnesses reported seeing no weapon, suggested he was shot in the back while trying to escape. The operators claimed they aimed to wound, to capture him alive. The evidence showed bullets to the torso and one through the ear, an execution-style wound that suggested close-range assassination. The truth died with Escobar when he collapsed on that rooftop at 3:15 p.m., blood pooling on terracotta tiles, the man who'd built an empire from powder and violence reduced to another corpse in a country that had seen too many. The ghost unit operators stood over him, confirming what seemed impossible. Pablo Escobar, the man who'd terrorized Colombia for 15 years, who'd killed thousands, who'd made himself untouchable, was dead. The radio chatter exploded. Viva Colombia, we got him, Pablo is dead. The city erupted in celebrations, people dancing in the streets, fireworks exploding, churches holding impromptu services. But amid the jubilation, questions began immediately. The nature of the wounds, the fact that no one tried to save him, the circumstances that looked suspiciously like an execution. Did someone make a decision in that moment? Did an operator, knowing Escobar's history of escaping justice, of corrupting systems, of returning stronger each time he'd been captured, choose to end it permanently? Or was it legitimate combat, a criminal who drew a weapon and was stopped by necessary force? The ghost unit members scattered after the operation, disappearing back into their official assignments or, for the Americans, returning to the United States where they'd spent decades being interviewed about those 16 months. Some became heroes, their stories told in books and movies. Others lived with PTSD from operations they couldn't discuss, from decisions made in gray zones where right and wrong blurred into something neither. Colonel Martinez, who'd led the hunt from the beginning, was celebrated as the man who'd saved Colombia. But his son, also an operator in the ghost unit, would later speak of the moral cost, the compromises required, the knowledge that they'd become almost as ruthless as the man they'd hunted. The DIA agents, Murphy and Peña, retired from the agency and spent years being asked the same questions. Did you know about Los Pepis? Did you participate in extrajudicial killings? Did the end justify the means? Their answers were always carefully worded, acknowledging complexity while avoiding specifics that could lead to prosecution. The truth was probably something they'd never fully admit, even to themselves. The official investigation into Escobar's death concluded it was a legitimate police operation. The wounds were consistent with a running gunfight. The weapon found near his body validated the self-defense claim. Case closed. But former Ghost Unit members, in unguarded moments years later, would sometimes admit what the official story omitted. That when they had Escobar cornered, when the opportunity presented itself, someone made a choice. Justice through courts had failed. Imprisonment had been a joke. Every legal avenue had been corrupted or circumvented. So they delivered the only justice Pablo Escobar would ever face, permanent and irreversible. The aftermath revealed the complexity of what they'd accomplished. Escobar's death didn't end Colombia's drug trade, other cartels filled the void immediately, and cocaine continued flooding into American cities with barely a disruption in supply. His family fled to Argentina, where they lived under assumed names, haunted by their association with Colombia's most infamous criminal. The Medellin cartel fragmented into smaller organizations, arguably making the drug trade harder to combat because there was no single leader to target. Some of the Ghost Unit's methods, the collaboration with Los Pepis, the extrajudicial killings, the constitutional violations, became controversial examples of counter-terrorism overreach, cautionary tales taught in law enforcement academies about the dangers of abandoning legal restraints. But Colombia changed. The bombings stopped. The assassinations of judges and journalists ended. The narco-terrorism that had paralyzed the government for a decade diminished to manageable criminal activity. Families could walk Medellin's streets without fearing random violence. The country began a slow, painful process of rebuilding its institutions, strengthening its judicial system, reclaiming sovereignty from criminal organizations. Whether that justified the Ghost Unit's methods remains debated. Human rights organizations condemned the operation as state-sponsored terrorism. Law enforcement professionals studied it as a necessary evil when dealing with criminals who'd made themselves immune to traditional justice. The operators themselves had mixed feelings, proud of what they'd accomplished, haunted by how they'd accomplished it, uncertain whether the cost to their own humanity had been worth the result. 20 years after Escobar's death, a reporter tracked down one of the Colombian operators who'd been on that rooftop. The man, now in his 50s, working a desk job in Bogotá, spoke carefully about that December afternoon. He confirmed the official story, the chase, the gunfire, the split-second decisions. But then he said something the reporter would remember. We were taught that justice requires evidence, trials, due process. But what do you do when the system is broken? When the criminal has corrupted every level of government? When letting him live means more innocent people die? We made a choice. Maybe it was wrong. Maybe we became monsters to fight a monster. But I sleep at night knowing Pablo Escobar will never kill again. Can you say the same about the judges who took his bribes? The politicians who looked the other way? The police officers who tipped him off? We ended it, finally, permanently, and Colombia is better for it, even if our souls aren't. The Ghost Unit operated for 16 months, conducted hundreds of raids, killed or captured dozens of cartel members, and ultimately ended with a single bullet on a Medellin rooftop. Their methods were questionable, their tactics were brutal, their adherence to legal niceties was non-existent. But they accomplished what years of legitimate law enforcement couldn't. They stopped Pablo Escobar. Whether that makes them heroes or criminals depends on your definition of justice, the clean, procedural kind that looks good in courtrooms and often fails to protect the innocent, or the messy, violent kind that abandons principle for results and lives with the consequences forever. The real Ghost Unit wasn't the sanitized version from TV shows. They were men who crossed lines, who made choices in moments of chaos that couldn't be unmade, who lived with the knowledge that they'd become almost as ruthless as their target. Some went on to distinguished careers, carrying their secrets silently. Others struggled with what they'd done, what they'd seen, what they'd become. All of them understood that hunting monsters requires entering darkness, and not everyone returns unchanged. The final image, the one that defines the entire operation, is Pablo Escobar's body on that rooftop, surrounded by operators, photographed from every angle as proof of his death. In those photographs, you can see the end of an era, the moment when Colombia's nightmare ended not with legal proceedings and prison sentences, but with gunfire and blood. The Ghost Unit delivered justice the only way Escobar would accept it. Final, absolute, irreversible, and 30 years later, Colombia still celebrates December 2nd as the day they were freed from terror, even if the methods used to achieve that freedom remain controversial, classified, and forever stained with moral ambiguity. Because that's the terrible truth about fighting evil that operates outside all rules. Sometimes defeating it requires abandoning the rules yourself, accepting that victory comes at the cost of your principles, and living with the weight of that choice for the rest of your life. The Ghost Unit made that choice. And whether you call them heroes or murderers, they ended Pablo Escobar's reign when no one else could. That has to count for something, even if exactly what it counts for remains forever unclear.